The finality of the act was in the sound the oak door made as it closed. It was not a slam of anger, but a heavy, oiled click of absolute conclusion. Gideon, her husband's brother, did not look at her as he shut it. His gaze was fixed on the latch as if it were a legal document he was signing. Outside on the porch of the house she had shared with Thomas, Elara stood with the world shrunk to a small leather purse and a folded piece of paper. Inside the purse were $12, the town council's magnanimous settlement for her dower rights. The paper was the deed to a parcel of land Thomas had won in a card game years ago, a joke he'd never bothered to file. It was known as the Stone's Shadow, a 40-acre splinter of north-facing cliff and scree that had never known a full day's sun. Gideon, in his performative generosity, had made sure the deed was legally transferred to her. He had given her the worthless thing to absolve himself of the valuable thing he had taken. The town of Providence watched. From the window of the mercantile, Mr. Gable adjusted a sack of flour, his pity a palpable force. From the church steps, the preacher's wife whispered to another, their hands covering their mouths, but not their judgment. They saw a woman of 24, widowed a month, now dispossessed by the very laws meant to protect her. Thomas had died without a written will, and Gideon's claim as his only male kin was ironclad. The farm, the good bottomland, the solid house, it was all his now. Elara had nothing left of her husband but the clothes on her back, sewn by her own hand, and the great silent dog at her side. Boro, a hound of indeterminate breeding, with a coat the color of winter dusk, pressed his shoulder against her leg. He was her last connection to the life that had just been locked away. Gideon's wife, pale and silent, had pressed the purse into Elara's hand. "Go east," she had whispered, her eyes pleading. "There is work in the cities. This is no place for you now." It was the sensible advice. It was the advice of surrender. Elara looked past the manicured street of Providence toward the jagged line of the western mountains. The Stone's Shadow was out there, a tomb they called it, a place where nothing grew. She felt the weight of the town's expectation. They expected her to fail, to take charity, to crawl back and beg for a scullery maid's position in her own brother-in-law's house. A cold knot of refusal tightened in her stomach. It was a feeling more real than grief, more potent than fear. She walked directly from the porch to the mercantile. Mr. Gable met her at the door, his face a mask of practiced sympathy. "A tragedy, Elara, a true tragedy. A ticket on the morning stagecoach is $4. It will take you as far as Prosperity Gulch." "I'll need an axe," she said. Her voice was flat, devoid of the emotion he expected. "A good one, and a whetstone." Gable blinked. "An axe?" "And 10 pounds of salt, 20 of flour, a sack of beans, and whatever seeds you have that will last the winter before planting." She placed 8 of her $12 on the counter. The coins made a small, defiant sound. He looked at the money, then at her face. The pity in his eyes curdled into a kind of morbid curiosity. He saw she was not buying passage. She was buying tools. He sold her the goods, his movement slow and deliberate, as if handling artifacts for a doomed expedition. The town watched as she left, the axe handle resting on her shoulder, the heavy sack slung over the other. Boro trotted at her heel, his head low. She did not look back. She turned her face toward the mountains and began to walk. The journey was a punishment. The road dissolved into a cart track, then a deer trail, then nothing at all. The land grew hostile, rising into stony hills where the soil was thin and grudging. She walked for 2 days, sleeping under a canvas sheet with Boro pressed against her for warmth. The weight of the sack was a screaming torment in her shoulders, and the axe, her one symbol of defiance, felt heavier with every mile. The landscape was a study in gray and brown, broken only by the stubborn green of pines clinging to the rock. She found the property marker late on the second day, a pyramid of stones Thomas had once built and laughed about. and she saw her inheritance. It was worse than the rumors. A sheer wall of dark granite rose hundreds of feet into the air, its face scarred and unforgiving. At its base was a wide, shallow alcove, perhaps 50 feet across and 20 feet deep, choked with a jumble of fallen rock and debris. The ground before it was a sloping field of scree and sharp-edged stones where only lichen grew. The air was cold, trapped in the permanent shadow of the cliff. The wind, coming over the top of the mountain, curled down the rock face like a physical blow. This was the moment of despair. It settled on her not like a blanket, but like a shroud of ice. The town was right. Gideon was right. This was a place to die. She slid down the side of a boulder, the heavy sack falling from her numb fingers. The sack split, spilling a precious stream of white flour onto the grimy stones. The waste of it, the sheer, stupid waste of it all, broke something inside her. A dry, silent sob shook her frame. Boro whined, nudging his cold nose into her hand. For a long, hollow moment, she believed it was over. But the wind was relentless. It clawed at her, stealing the warmth from her body, a thief with 1,000 icy fingers. Seeking any respite, she stumbled into the alcove, pressing herself into the back corner where the rock curved inward. The wind's howl softened to a dull moan. The air here was still, utterly still. She leaned her head back against the granite wall, closing her eyes, expecting the chilling cold of the stone. It did not come. The rock was not warm, but it was not cold either. It was neutral, holding a deep, resonant lack of chill that felt almost like warmth against the biting air. Her eyes snapped open. She pressed her bare palm flat against the stone. It felt solid, ancient, and deeply, profoundly stable. She ran her hands along the back wall, feeling its texture. Near the floor, half hidden by a pile of smaller rocks, she felt a faint, almost imperceptible draft. It wasn't cold air coming in, it was cool air being pulled out. There was a fissure, a crack leading up and into the heart of the mountain. She scrambled out of the alcove and looked up, truly seeing the cliff for the first time. It faced north, yes, but its vast, flat top faced south, baking all day in the unrelenting sun. The stone, this immense mountain of granite, was a battery. It drank the sun's fire on one side and held it deep within its core, bleeding it out slowly, stubbornly on the other. This worthless, sunless place had a secret. It had a heart of quiet, radiant heat. Despair did not vanish, but it retreated, replaced by a grim, aching resolve that felt like a hot coal in her gut. This was not a tomb, it was a foundation. The work began with her bare hands. For a week she did nothing but move rock. She cleared the alcove of the centuries of debris, sorting the stones by size. The larger, flatter ones she stacked carefully to one side. The smaller, jagged ones she piled separately. Her hands, soft from a life of sewing and cooking, were shredded within the first day. Blisters formed, broke, and bled, leaving raw patches of skin that burned with a white-hot fire every time she gripped a new stone. She worked until her muscles screamed and her back was a single column of agony. At night she would collapse onto her bedding, too exhausted to eat, and Boro would lick her raw hands, his presence a silent, steady comfort. Slowly the floor of the alcove was cleared, revealing a surface of packed earth and bedrock. It was now a defined space, a three-walled room with the sky for a roof. She then turned her attention to the trees. A stand of hardy, wind-stunted pines grew 100 yards away. Using the axe Thomas had cherished, she began the brutal work of felling them. The axe felt clumsy and monstrous in her hands at first, but she learned. She learned to read the grain, to let the weight of the head do the work, to feel the sharp bite as it sunk into the wood. Each tree was a victory that cost her dearly in sweat and pain. Boro, sensing the new rhythm of their life, would grab the ends of smaller branches in his teeth and help her drag them back to the site. With logs and the largest of the cleared stones, she began to build the fourth wall, enclosing the front of the alcove. It was not a wall of elegant log construction, but a thick, brutish barrier of stone and wood. She laid the largest, flattest stones as a foundation, then stacked logs between them, creating a solid, interlocking mass. She needed mortar, something to fill the gaps and seal the wall against the wind. Following a thin trickle of water that seeped from the cliff base, she found a deposit of thick gray clay. She spent days digging it out, mixing it with sand from the creek bed and water in a hollowed-out log. The resulting mortar was crude, but it was heavy and dense. She plastered the clay mortar into every crack and crevice of her wall, inside and out, her hands caked in the gritty mud. The wall grew, a monstrous thing nearly 3 feet thick. It was ugly, a patchwork of gray stone, pale wood, and darker gray clay, but it was solid. It felt eternal. She left a narrow opening for a door and a smaller square for a window. Next came the problem of heat and smoke. She chose one corner of the alcove, where the rock was smoothest, and began to build a fireplace. She used the best, most uniform stones, fitting them together with painstaking care. The chimney was the true challenge, but she remembered the fissure she had found, the one pulling air into the mountain. She built the back of her fireplace against that crack. With smaller stones and a thick plastering of clay, she channeled the smoke from her hearth directly into that natural vent. The mountain itself would be her chimney. The first fire was a moment of sacred importance. She laid it carefully, using the driest tinder she could find. With a flint and a steel from her pack, she struck a spark. It caught. A thin wisp of smoke curled up, hesitated, and then was drawn with a faint whisper into the fissure in the rock. It worked. The smoke vanished into the stone. She fed the fire, and a wave of radiant heat washed over her, the first true warmth she had felt that was not her own body's. That night she slept inside her half-finished shelter, the fire crackling, the stone wall at her back breathing a steady, gentle warmth. She laid a hand on it, feeling the deep, slow pulse of the mountain's stored heat. She was not just sheltered from the cold. She was living inside the answer to it. Her systems grew from necessity. The slow seep of water from the cliff face was her most precious resource. She followed it to its source, deep in a crack at the back of the alcove. There she excavated a small basin in the rock and earth, a foot deep and 3 feet wide. She spent 2 days lining it with the purest clay she could find, pounding it smooth and dense until it was watertight. The seep was agonizingly slow but relentless. Drop by drop it filled her tiny cistern. Within a week she had a permanent, protected source of clean, cold water inside her home. Food was the next battle. The scree field was useless, but 50 yards away, where the creek flattened out, there was a small patch of richer soil. For 2 weeks she did nothing but haul that soil, bucket by bucket, back to her shelter. In the cleared space just in front of her wall, she built 3 raised beds, framed with rocks. It was back-breaking, repetitive labor, but when she was done, she had 3 small plots of dark, living earth in a world of dead stone. There she planted her seeds, hardy beans, turnips, and kale. Inside the alcove, away from the fire but in the constant, stable temperature of the cave, she experimented. She gathered spores from mushrooms in the woods and cultivated them in a rotting log. In a shallow box of soil, she sprouted bean seeds for fresh greens. Her world was becoming a closed, working system. By late autumn, the structure was complete. She had fashioned a door from thick planks, split from a pine log, hung on leather hinges. The window was covered by a stretched, scraped deer hide, treated with fat to make it translucent. The inside of her home was not large, but it was orderly and secure. Her bed was a raised platform of wood covered in pine boughs, and her one blanket. Her food was stored in sacks along the back wall. The fire burned steadily, its smoke disappearing into the mountain. The air was cool but never cold, and the great stone wall behind her was a constant source of quiet warmth. But her supplies were dwindling, and she knew she could not survive the winter on beans and turnips alone. She needed protein and fat. She needed animals. That meant a trip back to Providence. She dreaded it, but it was necessary. She had spent the last of her money, but over the weeks she had found a secondary use for the mountain stone. Some of it was soapstone, soft and easy to carve. She spent her evenings by the fire shaping it into bowls and warming stones for beds. It was a trade. Her return to the town was a quiet spectacle. She walked down the main street, and whispers followed her like stray dogs. Her clothes were patched and stained with clay and pine tar. Her hair was wild. Her hands were no longer a woman's hands. They were calloused, scarred, and strong. She looked not broken, but forged. She went first to a new settler on the edge of town and traded her carved soapstone for $5 silver. Then she walked into Gable's Mercantile. The men warming themselves by the pot-bellied stove fell silent. Mr. Gable stared at her. He saw the money in her hand, and his expression shifted from shock to commercial interest. "I need 2 female goats," she said, "and 6 laying hens." Gable laughed, a short, sharp bark. "Goats? For what? That rock pile you live on? They'll fall and break their legs before you get them home, girl. And chickens? They'll freeze solid in the first frost." "Nevertheless," she said, placing the silver dollars on the counter, "that is what I need." The men by the stove snickered. Someone muttered the name they had for her, the Stone Widow. Another called her Shelter, the widow's hole. The humor was cruel, a weapon to reinforce their own sense of security and rightness. They lived in proper houses of wood and faith. She was a fool, scratching out a home in a place God had forgotten. The journey back was harder than the first. Leading 2 stubborn goats and carrying a crate of squawking chickens over the rough terrain was a nightmare. One of the goats slipped and nearly tumbled down a ravine, saved only by Ilara's desperate grip on its rope, the friction burning her hands raw again. But she got them home. She had built a small, sturdy pen for them in the deepest part of the alcove, where the warmth from the rock was most constant. The animals settled in, their soft noises filling the silence. The first time she collected a warm, brown egg from one of the hens, she held it in her palm like a jewel. It was more precious than gold. It was life. Gideon came to see her once before the snows began. He rode his fine horse as far as the trail would allow and walked the rest of the way. He stood outside her wall, his face a mixture of disgust and disbelief. He looked at the crude, massive wall, the hide window, the wisp of smoke that seemed to rise from the rock itself. He did not ask to come inside. "This is a tomb, Ilara," he said, his voice tight with a strange, angry pity. "Not a home. You're living in a cave like an animal. There's no shame in admitting defeat. Come back to town. My wife can find a place for you. A servant's life is an honest one." She was splitting wood when he arrived. She did not stop. She simply looked at him, her face unreadable, and then brought the axe down hard, splitting a log with a clean, sharp crack. The sound echoed in the cold air. She said nothing. Her silence was a more powerful answer than any words. He watched her for another moment, then turned and walked away, shaking his head at the sheer, willful foolishness of the woman. Deep winter came. The world outside her stone walls shrank and then vanished under a blanket of white. Her life fell into a simple, powerful rhythm. Wake in the near dark. The air would be cool, but the stone wall at her back was a steady, radiating warmth. Stir the embers in the hearth. Add a new log. The fire was the heart of her world, and it never went out. Milk the goats. Their warm milk, tasting faintly of pine, was her daily luxury. Check the snares she had set along the game trails. Collect the eggs from the hens. Tend her small indoor garden of sprouts. Sharpen the axe. Repair her clothes. The days were short, the nights long. She was utterly alone, but she was not lonely. The company of the animals, the steady presence of Boro, the constant demands of survival, they filled her world completely. She was the sovereign of a kingdom of 40 acres, a queen whose castle was a hole in a rock. She was not just surviving, she was presiding over a small, intricate world of her own making, a world that worked. The winter offered smaller tests before the great one. A pack of wolves driven by hunger found her shelter. She woke one night to their howls, a sound that would have terrified her in a wooden cabin. Boro stood at the door, a low growl rumbling in his chest, but he was not afraid. The wolves could circle and sniff, but the thick stone and log walls were impenetrable. They could not get in. After 2 nights of fruitless circling, they moved on. Another time, a week of heavy, wet snow was followed by a sudden thaw, sending a cascade of meltwater down the cliff face. It poured over her shelter, but her roof, made of thick pine slabs sealed with clay and pitch, held. Not a single drop came through. Her systems were tested, and they worked. Then, in the heart of January, came the blizzard. Later they would call it the Great Freeze of '83, a storm that became a landmark in the town's memory. It did not arrive like a normal storm. It began with the cold, a deep, unnatural cold that fell over the mountains like a judgment. The temperature dropped 30 degrees in a single afternoon. The very air seemed to crackle and shrink. Then came the wind, a shrieking, solid force that scoured the landscape. And finally the snow began, not flakes, but a blinding, horizontal torrent of ice and powder. Inside her shelter, Ilara felt the change. The wind screamed over the top of the cliff, a sound like a freight train passing a mile above her head. But her wall, nestled at the base, felt almost no direct pressure. The temperature inside dropped, but only by a few degrees. She added another log to the fire. The stone wall behind her continued its slow, steady radiation of heat. It was a battle between the storm's fury and the mountain's thermal inertia, and the mountain was winning. Her animals were calm, chewing their cud in the quiet warmth of their pen. The water in her cistern remained liquid. She was not fighting the storm. She was simply outside its reach. In Providence, the world was ending. The conventional log cabins built with pride and tradition bled heat from 1,000 tiny gaps. The wind forced its way through chinking and under doors. Families huddled around their fireplaces, burning through their wood piles at a terrifying rate. The snow, heavier and wetter than any they had ever seen, began to accumulate on the roofs. The sound of creaking timbers became a constant, terrifying chorus. Mr. Gable's Grand Mercantile, the symbol of the town's prosperity, was the first to suffer a major blow. The wind blew out its large glass windows, and the storm poured in, ruining his stock and turning the inside of the store into a maelstrom of snow and ice. The church bell, which was meant to be rung in emergencies, was silent. The rope had frozen solid. The community's confidence, their bedrock belief in the rightness of their ways, was shattering like frozen glass. Livestock, left in barns that were now no warmer than the outside, began to die, their bodies freezing solid in the stalls. People started burning furniture to stay alive. The town wasn't just under siege, it was collapsing from within. On the 3rd day of the storm, Ilara heard a sound that did not belong. It was not the wind. It was a frantic, desperate banging on her door. Boro was already there, not barking, but emitting a low, urgent growl. She took a burning brand from the fire for light and pulled open the heavy plank door. A figure, a man encrusted in snow and ice, fell inside, collapsing onto the earthen floor. She rolled him over. It was Brant, a young trapper, one of the men who had laughed loudest at her in the mercantile. His face was a mask of ice, his lips blue. He was barely conscious. She dragged him toward the fire, pulling off his frozen coat. Boro licked the man's face, trying to warm him. "Sarah!" he gasped, his voice a raw whisper. My wife, the baby." She gave him a dipper of warm broth from the pot simmering by the fire. He drank it greedily, his hands shaking so violently he could barely hold the cup. He told her his story in broken phrases. The roof of their cabin had collapsed under the snow. His wife, Sarah, had gone into labor 2 days before. They had a newborn son, and they were freezing to death. He had come for help, knowing it was his only chance. Elara looked at him, and for a moment she felt the bitter memory of his mockery. She saw his laughing face in the warm, safe mercantile. She looked at her own stores, her firewood stacked neatly and dry, her preserved food, enough for her and her animals to last until spring, but not infinite. Helping him would cost her. It would put her own survival at risk. It was a choice. But then she saw the raw terror in his eyes, the plea of a husband and a new father. The choice was no choice at all. She could not live in a world she had built for survival if she let a man and his family die on her doorstep, not because he deserved it, but because she could help. "Stay here," she commanded, her voice firm. "Get warm." She moved with practiced efficiency. She loaded a small hand sled with dry pine logs. She wrapped stones that had been heating by the hearth in thick blankets. She filled a sealed pot with more hot broth. She pulled on her own thickest coat and wrapped her face in wool. Boro seemed to understand. He stood by the door, whining with a mixture of anxiety and purpose. "Show me the way," she said to Brant. He struggled to his feet. Together, they opened the door and stepped out into the screaming chaos of the storm. The journey to his cabin was a battle for every step. The wind was a solid wall that tried to push them back. The snow was waist-deep, a thick sucking powder that drained their strength. Boro went ahead, his powerful body breaking a trail for them to follow. Twice Brant fell, and twice Elara and the dog had to drag him back to his feet. He was fading, but the sight of her, a lone woman pushing relentlessly forward into the teeth of the blizzard, seemed to give him a strength he did not know he had. They found the cabin half buried, a gaping black hole where the roof had been. Inside, huddled under a single blanket amid the snow and debris, was Sarah, clutching a tiny, silent bundle to her chest. Her face was ashen with cold. Elara did not waste a second. She wrapped the mother and child in the warm blankets and placed the heated stones around them. She gave Sarah the hot broth. Life, slow and fragile, began to return to their eyes. The journey back was a slow, desperate procession. Elara and Brant carried Sarah on a makeshift stretcher. Boro scouted ahead, his dark form the only landmark in the whiteout. When they finally reached the shelter and stumbled inside, the contrast was so profound it felt like a dream. The warmth hit them first, a gentle, penetrating heat that seemed to come from the very stones. Then the light, the soft, steady glow of the fire. Then the sounds, the quiet munching of the goats, the soft clucking of the hens. Brant and Sarah stared, their eyes wide with disbelief. They saw the neat stacks of firewood, the rows of preserved vegetables in glass jars, the small box of green things growing near the fire. They saw a world of impossible order, a sanctuary of life carved into the heart of a dead and frozen world. This was not the pathetic widow's hole of their gossip. It was an ark. Brant looked from the calm, organized space to Elara's face, and he could not speak. Shame and awe warred within him. For 2 days they lived there as the storm raged outside. Elara cared for them, sharing her food, her warmth, her water. She said nothing of their past mockery. She simply provided. She showed Sarah how to milk the goat for the baby. She treated Brant's frostbite. Her grace was as solid and unwavering as the stone wall behind them. When the storm finally broke, the world was silent, white, and dazzlingly bright. A search party from Providence, led by Gideon and Mr. Gable, had set out to find the missing trapper and his wife. They followed Brant's faint tracks, expecting to find bodies. Instead, they found the shelter. They saw the thin, almost invisible wisp of smoke rising from the cliff face. They stopped 50 feet away, staring at the strange, solid wall of stone and wood. Gideon called out his brother-in-law's name, his voice tight with dread. The door opened, and Brant stepped out, blinking in the bright sun. He was alive. He was well. Gable and Gideon pushed past him and stepped inside. They stopped dead, their faces a picture of stunned incomprehension. They saw Sarah, alive, with her newborn son sleeping peacefully. They felt the impossible warmth. They saw the evidence of a life not of bare survival, but of thriving ingenuity. Mr. Gable, the practical man of commerce, the purveyor of sensible advice, was the first to speak. He looked at the clay-lined cistern, the indoor garden, the animals living in the warmth. He looked at Ilara's calloused hands. His gaze was filled with a humility she had never seen in him. "We were wrong," he said, his voice quiet and heavy. "We called you a fool. My God, we were the fools." He looked around again at the massive stone wall, the clever use of the mountain itself. "We called it the Widow's Hole. It's an ark. You built an ark." Gideon stood silently, his face a mask of complex emotions. He saw the life she had built from the rubble he had condescendingly granted her. He had left her to die on a worthless piece of rock, and she had turned that rock into the safest place in the entire valley. His authority, his wealth, his fine wooden house, all of it had been proven fragile and wanting. Her quiet, stubborn work had shamed him more profoundly than any accusation could have. Ilara simply ladled more broth into bowls. She handed one to Gable and one to her brother-in-law. Her expression was not triumphant. It was not vengeful. It was calm, serene, and deeply rooted in the place she stood. "There is food," she said. "Eat." In the weeks that followed the Great Freeze, the town's relationship with Ilara transformed. The derisive nicknames vanished, replaced by a quiet, awestruck respect. People no longer came to pity, but to learn. They brought her goods to trade, not as charity, but as a fair exchange for her knowledge. They asked about the thickness of her walls, about the clay mortar, about how she vented her smoke. The stone's shadow was no longer a name spoken with a sneer. It was spoken with reverence. Gideon came to her alone one day in early spring. He brought with him the deed to the old farm, to the good bottomland, and the house he had taken from her. He offered it to her, his eyes downcast. "It's yours," he said. "It was always meant to be yours." Ilara looked at the paper, then back at the great cliff that was her home. She shook her head. "My land is here," she said, placing a hand on the sun-warmed stone of her wall. "This land is mine." She had no need for his redemption. She had forged her own. Her story spread, carried by travelers and trappers to other settlements. The principles she had discovered through necessity became a new kind of local wisdom. New homes built in the valley began to incorporate her ideas. They were built with thick stone foundations, walls dug partially into hillsides to take advantage of the earth's insulation. People began to understand that the greatest strength was not in standing against the wilderness, but in learning to partner with it. The stone shadow way became the term for building a house that could endure. Years passed. Ilara remained. She expanded her home, carving new rooms from the rock, building a small, bright greenhouse against the south-facing side of a nearby boulder. She raised her goats and chickens, tended her gardens, and lived a life of quiet, profound independence. She never remarried. She had built a life so complete, so perfectly fitted to her world, that there was no room for anything that was not as solid and true as the stone itself. She lived to be an old woman, her face a map of the sun and wind, her hands as tough and textured as the rock she called home. She would sit on a bench outside her door in the evenings, the great stone wall at her back, still radiating the day's sun, a gentle, faithful warmth. Boro was long gone, but his descendants, great quiet hounds with coats the color of dusk, were always at her side. She would look out at the valley, at the lights of Providence twinkling in the distance, a town that had once cast her out and now looked to her story as one of its founding legends. She had been given nothing but a worthless place, and from it she had built not just a shelter, but a legacy, a quiet testament to the enduring truth that what others discard can be the very cornerstone of a life, and that true strength is not the power to dominate, but the resilience to build.